Jake parked and walked into the diner, its lights brightening up the dead, dark night. He was famished, not having eaten for hours. Although there wasn't much longer to drive, and he was desperate to see his mother, he had to get a bite. It was better to eat now than show up at the hospice hungry and unable to focus on what was happening. Inside the diner was as comforting as the lights promised. A few patrons were dotted around the red tables, hands curled around steaming mugs, faces dipped towards plates of comfort food. He couldn't smell anything, and he noticed that, and the silence. No clinking of cutlery, no coffee and bacon aroma. He'd been driving along the highway for hours, focused on getting to his mother while keeping his looming grief at bay. His senses were out of joint. There was nothing wrong with the hot plate of food the server pushed over to him. He couldn't remember what he ordered, just that it was plentiful and warm. He shoveled it into his mouth, feeling the goodness radiating along his tired limbs. He sipped the coffee, and it flowed through his veins, lifting the veil of fatigue, and he looked around. The server was pretty, but he couldn't risk arriving late. The hospice staff had been kind but clear. He pushed his credit card to the pretty server. She smiled broadly and said something he couldn't hear or understand. On the house? Why? He didn't have time to discuss. He pocketed his wallet, nodded, and headed out. He almost missed the door, narrowly avoiding walking into the wall. He looked back at the diner, its twinkling lights still advertising "Diner Open," the only lights visible. The windows were dark. What? He didn't have time. He had to get to his mother, but he needed gas. There was a gas station just on the other side of the highway. He drove in, the first rays of dawn piercing the darkness. Pumping gas, he glanced over his shoulder. In the gray light, he couldn't see the diner lights. No building. The other side of the highway was emptiness. Jake cried out. An elderly man pumping next to him looked up. "Son?" "There was a diner there," muttered Jake, and his free hand pointed across the highway to the gray nothingness. The man said grimly, "Son, you're not from around here if you don't know what happened there. That diner closed after all that hullabaloo and got torn down a few years back. Nobody was eating there no more." Jake stood quite still. He could still feel the warmth of the food in his body, the aftertaste of coffee in his mouth. He looked at the old man, who was minding his business pumping gas. He needed to get back on the road. He had to get to his mother. Quickly, he swiped his credit card and paid for the gas, jumped into his car, and tore off.